No man wants a wife with opinions, the Duke declared. His sister laughed. 3 weeks later, he was sitting in a milliner's back room, being corrected by the one woman in England who'd never once asked his permission to speak. By Sunday, he'd be on his knees taking it all back and discovering exactly what he'd been missing. Marlbury was a village that kept its own time. The church clock had stopped in 1809, its hands frozen at 2:15, and no one had thought it urgent enough to mend. Margaret Hale had been 17 that year. She sometimes thought the whole village had frozen with it, content to let the rest of England rush past, while Marlbury minded its hedgerows and its gossip and very little else. She did not mind the stillness. She minded only the talk that came with it. "You'll ruin your eyes working by that window in this light," said Nell Tovey, not looking up from the bonnet she was trimming. "And you'll ruin my nerves, sighing like that every quarter hour." I did not sigh. You sighed. It was a small sigh, but I heard it. Nell held the bonnet to the light, turning it. "Is it the Pemberton order, or the other thing?" "There is no other thing." "There is always another thing with you, Meg. You simply don't call it by its name." Meg set down her needle and looked out at Marlbury's High Street, narrow and green-shuttered, where Mrs. Findlay was attempting to herd 2 children past the baker's without buying anything, and failing. It was an ordinary Tuesday. It would not stay that way. Her shop, Hale's, the sign said, nothing more because her father had believed a name needed no decoration to be trusted, sat at the bend where the High Street met the lane to the old mill. It had been her father's shop before it was hers, and before that his trade had been something else entirely. Clerking for the Wycombe estate, 3 decades of careful hand and careful silence, until he'd saved enough to set his daughter up in something wholly her own. He had died 4 years past. Meg had kept the shop, kept his ledgers, kept the small back room exactly as he'd left it, full of papers she had never quite found the courage or the reason to sort. She was about to find both. 3 miles distant at Wycombe Hall, Julian Render, Duke of Wycombe, was losing an argument he had not agreed to have. "Now you needn't look so wounded," said his sister. "I'm only saying that Lady Frome's daughter asked after you twice at the Ardens rout, and you cannot keep pretending you don't notice when a woman asks after you twice." "I noticed," Julian said. "I noticed and I left." Lady Cordelia Render had inherited their mother's eyes and their father's patience for nonsense, which was to say none at all. She set down her teacup with the particular click that meant she was not finished. "You left a perfectly amiable young woman standing by the punch table." She was not standing alone. She was standing with her mother, who had already begun discussing settlements before I'd said 3 words to the daughter. "Because you are a duke, Julian, and that is what mothers do. Then mothers ought to teach their daughters to speak for themselves before they teach them to wait for a proposal." He said it more sharply than he meant to, and regretted the edge of it, though not the substance. Cordelia studied him with the look she reserved for moments she intended to remember. "You don't want a wife who waits to be told what to think," she said slowly. "You want one who already knows and agrees with you before you finish the sentence." "I want a wife who does not require management," Julian said. "There is a difference." "Is there?" "A man comes home from a day spent managing tenants and arguing with solicitors. He does not wish to come home and manage a wife as well. No man wants a wife with opinions, Cordelia. Not really. He wants peace. He wants a household that runs without a battle fought over every decision in it." He said it the way he said most things he believed firmly, flatly as fact, the kind of statement that did not invite contradiction because he had not considered that it required defending. Cordelia laughed, a short, delighted sound that made him immediately suspicious. "Write that down somewhere," she said. "I should like to have it in your own hand for later." "For what later?" "You'll see." She rose, smoothing her skirts, entirely too pleased with herself. "Now, before you forget you are a duke with duties, Mr. Abel is below, and he says it cannot wait." It could not, as it turned out, wait. Mr. Abel, the estate's long-suffering steward, stood in the hall with the particular grey pallor of a man bringing bad news to someone who did not like surprises. "It's the Marlbury boundary, Your Grace. The old question over the southern strip. Lord Petrie's grandson has raised it again, formally this time, through solicitors. He claims his grandfather's exchange of grazing rights for passage along the ford was never properly settled, that it was a verbal understanding only, and that the strip itself was never rightly granted, only the use of it." "There were papers. I know there were papers." "There were, Your Grace. Kept, as it happens, not in this house, but by old Hale, your grandfather's clerk in Marlbury, who witnessed the exchange and recorded its terms in his own hand. Hale is 4 years dead. The estate's own copy of the witnessed agreement was lost in the fire at the old steward's house in 1798. Hale's record is the only complete account remaining of what was actually exchanged, and on what terms. Julian felt the particular cold settle that came with realizing a problem was about to cost him more than money. It isn't a question of who held the freehold then. It's a question of what rights were exchanged, and whether the exchange was properly witnessed. Precisely so, Your Grace. The land itself was never alienated. Your grandfather couldn't have granted it outright even had he wished to, the southern strip being entailed with the rest. But the right of passage and the grazing exchange attached to it are a separate matter entirely. And if Hale's record can't be produced and verified, Petrie's grandson means to argue the whole arrangement was never properly made at all, and claim the passage for himself by default. Then send for the ledger. Mr. Abel's pallor deepened by a shade. I attempted that, Your Grace, some months past, before this turned formal. Miss Hale, the daughter who has the shop now, declined to hand the papers over to anyone but a principal party. She said, if I may quote her precisely, that she did not intend to let 3 decades of her father's careful work be misfiled by a man who couldn't tell a boundary stake from a fence post. Despite himself, Julian's mouth twitched. She said that to you? She did, Your Grace, and she was not wrong about the fence post. I am not a countryman. So I am to go to Marlbury myself. I fear there is no other way, Your Grace. The record exists in her father's particular shorthand by all account. Half the village swears no one alive can read it but her. If the matter goes before the courts without a properly read and verified account of the original witnessed exchange, you stand to lose the right of passage, the grazing terms attached to it, and very likely the case costs besides. Julian exhaled slowly. He had wanted this month exactly 2 things: to finish the drainage dispute in the East Fields, and to avoid his sister's matchmaking with as much dignity as possible. Neither ambition had survived breakfast. Have the carriage ready within the hour, he said. And Abel, don't tell my sister where I'm going. She'll find some way to make it her business. Meg had not expected a duke to simply appear in her shop on a Tuesday, and she resented faintly that he managed to make the appearing look effortless. He came in without ceremony. No outriders, no announcement, just a tall, fair-haired man in a well-cut coat who had to duck slightly under the doorframe her father had built for shorter men. He took off his hat. He looked, for one unguarded moment, entirely lost. The look of a man who had never in his life had to find a shop by its sign, rather than be shown to it by a footman. Nell, behind the counter, went very still. Meg did not. We're not yet open to custom for the season's new trimmings, Meg said, not looking up from the hat she was blocking. If you're after a gift for someone, I can recommend Mrs. Carrow's 2 doors down. I'm not here for a hat. Most men say that and leave with one regardless. She glanced up then, and the word she'd half prepared, something brisk about ribbon and patience, died somewhere in her throat, because she recognized, with the sinking clarity of someone whose week had just changed shape, exactly who was standing in her father's old doorway. She had seen him once before at a distance at her father's funeral, the old duke, not this one. This one had the same height, the same blunt directness in how he held himself, but where the grandfather had been dark, this one was fair, pale gold hair, cut without fashionable affectation, and eyes a clear deep blue that did nothing at all to soften the assessing way he looked at her. You're Miss Hale, he said. It was not quite a question. I am, and you're the Duke of Wycombe, which means you're here about my father's ledger, which means Mr. Abel has already been and gone and didn't care for what I told him. Something flickered across his face, surprise briefly, that she'd assembled the whole matter before he'd said a word of it. You assume a great deal. I assume very little, Your Grace. I simply know what's owed and to whom, which is rather the point of keeping ledgers. She set down the hat block. You'll want my father's record of the exchange your grandfather made over the southern passage. I have it. I am not handing it over. Beside her, Nell made a small sound that might have been a laugh, hastily disguised as a cough. Julian's expression did not change exactly, but something in his posture shifted, the particular straightening of a man unaccustomed to refusal and entirely unsure what to do with it. Miss Hale, I should think you understand the gravity of the matter. The Petrie claim, if unanswered with a proper account of the original exchange, could cost you the passage, the grazing terms attached to it, and a tidy sum in court fees. Yes, Mr. Abel was good enough to leave that part out when he tried to take the ledger off me in March. But I read the papers as well as the next person, Your Grace, and I know what's at stake for you. Then you understand why I require it. I understand why you'd like to take it, What I will not have is some clerk in London squinting at my father's shorthand and getting half of it wrong, because half wrong on a question of rights is worse than no answer at all. It's an answer someone will trust and shouldn't." She wiped her hands on her apron, entirely unhurried, which she could see was beginning to try his patience. "My father wrote in his own hand, his own abbreviations, 30 years of habit no one else ever learned because no one else needed to. I can read it. You cannot. Mr. Abel certainly cannot. So if you want the truth of what was exchanged and on what terms, and not merely a guest dressed up as one, you'll need me as much as the ledger." The silence that followed was not, she thought, the silence of a man considering whether she was right. It was the silence of a man realizing he had walked in expecting an errand and found an argument instead, and that the argument had a point he could not simply override with rank. "You're proposing to read the record to me yourself," he said finally. "I'm proposing that you cannot have one without the other. Take it as you like." A long moment. Then unexpectedly the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one swiftly suppressed, as though he'd caught himself enjoying something he hadn't meant to. "Very well, Miss Hale. When may I call to begin?" "You may call Thursday. Mornings only. I keep my afternoons for custom, and a duke standing about my shop is custom I cannot afford to lose by frightening it off." "You think I'd frighten your customers?" "I think a duke in a milliner's shop on a Tuesday has already given Mrs. Findlay enough to discuss until Michaelmas. I'd rather not compound it. And you'll come to the back room directly. My assistant will be within call the whole while, as is proper." "Of course," he said with the faint surprised courtesy of a man who had not thought to ask, and was glad someone had settled it before he needed to. He inclined his head the smallest fraction, the bow of a man unused to losing an exchange, and unwilling to let it show that he had, and left, ducking again beneath the doorframe her father had built for shorter men, and somehow making even that look like he'd decided to allow it. The bell over the door had barely stopped its small, startled ring before Nell turned, eyes wide. "You told a duke he could not have his own boundary papers. I told a duke he could not have them without me. There's a difference. Meg, that is not a small difference. That is the entire difference. Does it occur to you that you've just invented several mornings a week of obligation to a man who could, with one word to the right people, make absolutely certain you never sell another bonnet in this county?" Meg picked the hat block back up, turned it once in her hands and did not let her own pulse, which had admittedly picked up somewhat during the exchange, show in her voice. "It occurs to me," she said, "that my father's ledger is the only thing standing between that man and losing a right his own family has used for 20 years, and that he needs me a good deal more than I need him. That seems to me an excellent position to argue from." "That is not what I asked." "It's the answer you're getting." But she found, setting the hat aside, that her hands were not quite steady, and she did not examine too closely why. Thursday came grey and close, the kind of morning Marlbury specialized in, mist sitting low over the lane until nearly 9. Julian arrived at 8:30 regardless, which told Meg something about him before he'd said a word, a man who did not wait to be comfortable before doing what needed doing. She led him to the back room without ceremony, her father's old study, unchanged since his death, shelves of ledgers in chronological order, a desk scarred with decades of careful work. Nell took up her sewing in the front of the shop, near enough to be summoned by a raised voice and far enough to allow conversation its own privacy, which satisfied propriety and Meg's own sense of order both. Julian looked around the back room the way a man looks at a space he didn't expect to find moving. He kept this himself? No clerk, no assistant? He didn't trust assistance with another man's land rights. Said a mistake on paper outlives the man who made it. She pulled down the relevant ledger, 1788 through 1799, and set it on the desk between them. "Sit, if you mean to stay. This will take more than one morning." He sat. It was, she would think later, the first properly unguarded thing she saw him do, settling into a dead clerk's chair without complaint, waiting for her to begin, a duke arranging himself around her schedule rather than the reverse. "Your father's hand," he said, looking at the page she'd opened. "I cannot make sense of half of it. No one but me can, which is rather the point I made on Tuesday." She turned the ledger toward herself, tracing a line of cramped abbreviation with one finger. "Here, this mark, the little flag above the entry, means witnessed, terms confirmed by both parties." He had a whole private alphabet for what was certain and what wasn't. Most men recording an exchange simply write what they're told and trust it. My father wrote what was agreed, and then he wrote whether he'd seen it agreed. That seems an unusual amount of caution for a clerk's ledger. He was an unusual clerk. She didn't look up. He thought most disputes that reached court could have been settled in a kitchen if anyone had bothered writing down what was actually said instead of what people wished had been said. He took it as his particular duty to make sure the truth outlived the argument. Julian was quiet for a moment, studying the page as though it had become suddenly more than a means to an end. That is, I confess, not what I expected to find in a milliner's back room. You expected a milliner, Your Grace. You did not expect a man who spent 30 years correcting other men's certainties. There was an edge in it, not unkind, but pointed enough that he heard it. And you've inherited the habit. I've inherited the ledgers. The habit was already mine. She turned the page. Now, the Southern Passage. Your grandfather and the elder Mr. Petrie settled it in 91 by my father's account, with a witness present and properly recorded, not merely a handshake in a field, as the present Mr. Petrie likes to claim here. She read it to him, translating as she went, her father's compressed shorthand unspooling into plain sentences. Agreed before witness J. Caro Miller. Passage along the ford granted in exchange for grazing on the North Common. Terms to stand so long as both parties observe them. No further claim to be raised by either house regarding the same. Julian listened with the particular attention of a man accustomed to being told things, rarely to being taught them, and finding the second sensation unexpectedly tolerable. Caro, he said, is he living? His son is. Old Caro died some years back, but the son was there as a boy. Might remember enough to confirm it if it comes to that. I can ask if you like, though I expect he'll want asking properly and not summoned. I would not dream of summoning anyone in your village, Miss Hale. I gather it would not go well for me. It would not, she agreed, and caught for the first time something almost like amusement crossing his face, not quite a smile, but its near relation, there and then carefully put away. They worked through the morning. He asked sharper questions than she'd expected, not a man performing diligence for her benefit, but one who actually wished to understand the shape of his own land and its history, who flinched slightly at the parts where his grandfather had clearly overreached and did not try to argue the record into kindness. She found, somewhat against her will, that she respected that. Thursday again, she said when the light began to shift and she judged the morning spent. I've custom coming at 11 I can't put off. Thursday, he agreed, and then at the door almost as an afterthought. Your father sounds as though he was a remarkable man. He was an irritating one, mostly. He thought being right mattered more than being liked, and he was usually right, which made him very hard to argue with. She said it lightly, and was surprised to find her throat tighten slightly on the last word. Julian noticed. She could see him notice, but he had the grace not to remark on it, only inclined his head and left, and she stood for a moment in the empty shop, feeling unaccountably unsettled by a man who had done nothing more than listen properly. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. It became, without either of them quite naming it as such, a fixture. Thursday mornings in her father's study, ledgers between them, Nell stitching within call in the front room, the slow excavation of 3 decades' worth of careful disputes. Marlbury noticed, as Marlbury noticed everything. The Duke's carriage was at Hale's again this morning, Mrs. Findlay informed the baker's wife, loudly enough to be overheard by exactly the people she intended to overhear it. Second week running now. One does wonder what business requires quite so many mornings. Boundary papers, the baker's wife said, unconvinced. So they say. So they say. Nell relayed this exchange to Meg, with the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed gossip most when it wasn't aimed at her. You ought to know they're talking. Let them talk. I'm reading him a ledger, Nell, not... Meg stopped because she didn't entirely know how to finish that sentence without admitting more than she wished to. Not what? Nothing. There's nothing to finish. You blushed finishing it. I did not. You're doing it now. Meg turned back to her work with rather more force than the ribbon required, and did not dignify this with an answer, because there was, infuriatingly, no answer that wouldn't prove Nell's point. It was the third Thursday when something shifted, not dramatically but unmistakably, the way weather turns before anyone's named the change. They had reached 1796, the year of the mill dispute, a tangled matter involving access to the upper sluice that even Meg's father's careful hand had recorded with visible exasperation. Julian leaned over the ledger, close enough that she could see the precise line of his jaw, the small scar above one eyebrow she hadn't noticed before, and found herself distracted by it in a way that annoyed her considerably. Here, she said perhaps too quickly, pointing to a line to cover the lapse. This is where it turns. Your grandfather granted the Carrows the right of access in exchange for... Her finger and his collided on the page, both reaching for the same line. Neither moved for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Forgive me," he said, withdrawing his hand first, though not, she noticed hastily. "There's nothing to forgive. It's a ledger, not a—" She stopped herself before the sentence found somewhere undignified to go, and busied herself with the next page instead, aware of her own pulse in a way she resented. He did not press it, but he was quiet for a moment afterward, and when he spoke again, it was not about the ledger. "May I ask you something, Miss Hale, that isn't about boundaries?" "Oh, you may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." A pause. "Why the shop? You could have sold it after your father died, taken the money, married, found an easier life than this one." "Because the shop is mine," she said simply. "Not my father's, not a husband's, not anyone's loan to me until they decide otherwise. Mine. I built half this trade myself after he died. The Pemberton order, the new ribbon supplier, the trimming work for 3 counties' worth of brides. I'm not interested in trading what I built for the privilege of being someone's dependent, however comfortable the dependency. That's not how most women describe marriage. Most women haven't run a business through 2 bad harvests and a father's death without a single man stepping in to make it easier. I have. I find I prefer answering to myself." She looked at him directly. "I expect that sounds like exactly the sort of opinion a man would rather his wife not have." Something crossed his face then, quick, almost wary, as though she'd struck closer to something than she knew. He recovered it well, but not perfectly. "What makes you say that?" "Only that most men I've met find a woman with a settled opinion of her own rather trying. I find it a useful filter, saves time." He said nothing for a long moment, and she could not read what moved behind his eyes, something between discomfort and recognition, as though she had, without meaning to, quoted him to himself. "So you may be right," he said finally carefully, "about most men." It was, she thought afterward, an oddly evasive thing for a man who otherwise spoke plainly, and she filed the strangeness of it away, without quite knowing what to do with it yet. Cordelia found out, of course, because Cordelia found out everything. 3 Thursdays running, Julian. And you didn't think to mention where you were going. It's an estate matter, the Petrie question. The Petrie question does not require a duke to personally attend a milliner's shop at 8:30 in the morning for 3 weeks running. Mr. Abel could attend a boundary matter. Mr. Abel cannot read the relevant record. Miss Hale can. Miss Hale. Cordelia repeated the name with the particular relish of a woman storing it away for later use. And is Miss Hale agreeable? Easy to manage? The sort of woman who agrees with you before you finish a sentence? Julian, despite himself, felt the corner of his mouth twitch with something that was not quite irritation. "She is the most disagreeable woman I have met in several years." "Is she?" "She argued with me on Tuesday about whether a duke ought to involve himself at all in a dispute that touches common land used by half the village. She was infuriatingly correct." Cordelia set down her needlework entirely, which Julian had learned over 30 years to recognize as a declaration of war. "You find her disagreeable," she said slowly, "and infuriating and correct, and you return every Thursday regardless. The matter is unresolved." "The matter," said his sister, with the terrible satisfaction of a woman who has just watched her brother's own words come home to roost, "sounds entirely resolved to me. You have simply not yet admitted what it is." "There is nothing to admit, Cordelia. No man wants a wife with opinions," Cordelia said with relish, each word placed with surgical precision. "Write it down, you said. I should like it in your own hand for later. Do you recall saying that?" Julian did not answer, which was in itself an answer, and Cordelia's smile told him she knew it perfectly well. The assembly at the Marlbury Rooms was a modest affair by London standards. A fiddler, a long table of indifferent punch, the same 40 families who had been dancing the same sets for 2 generations. It was not the kind of event a duke ordinarily attended. Julian attended it. He told himself it was a matter of courtesy. The local families expected some acknowledgement of his presence in the district, and Mr. Abel had all but insisted. He did not examine too closely the fact that he had asked, before accepting the invitation, whether Miss Hale was likely to be present. She was. She stood near the wall with Nell, not dancing, watching the room with the particular wry attention of a woman who had made her own hats for half the women on the floor and found it more interesting to note which ones had been altered badly than to join the set. "So you came," she said when he crossed the room to her, not quite masking her surprise. Mr. Abel was persuasive, or perhaps merely persistent. That sounds like Mr. Abel. She studied him a moment. You dance, I assume. Dukes generally do. Possibly, do you? When asked properly, which is rarely, given my situation tends to make men nervous about the wrong things. A dry note, not quite bitter. They worry I'll correct their figures in the dance as readily as I correct their ledgers. Would you? Only if they deserved it. He held out his hand before he had entirely decided to, and she looked at it, then at him, and something passed between them that neither chose to name, a brief, deliberate weighing of consequence, and then she took it anyway. It was, she would think later, a mistake she made with her eyes open. The set was a country dance, brisk and orderly, hands clasped and released in turn as the figures called them together and apart. There was no occasion for anything closer, and Meg was glad of it, glad too that the form of the dance gave her somewhere to look besides directly at him, and something to count besides the unreasonable attention she was paying to exactly how long his hand held hers at each turn, before propriety required him to let go. The set ended. They stood together a moment, both slightly breathless, waiting for the next figure to be called, and it was in that pause, the music paused too, the dancers catching their wind, the room's chatter rising to fill the gap, that Mrs. Findlay's voice carried clearly across the floor from her post by the punch table, pitched for exactly the audience she intended. The Duke, dancing with the milliner and looking very pleased about it besides. Well, a pause waited with everything a pause could carry in a room this small. One does wonder what Lord Petrie's solicitors will make of that, given the boundaries still unsettled between the houses. It was not said to Meg directly. It reached her regardless in the lull between sets, the way such things always did, carried on currents no one bothered to disguise. She felt the heat rise in her face, not embarrassment alone, but something sharper, the particular sting of being discussed as though she were a transaction rather than a person, as though 3 weeks of careful, honest work over her father's ledger had been quietly reclassified by the room into something else entirely. Ignore her, Julian said quietly beside her. Easily said by a man who isn't the one she's discussing. She's discussing me as well. She's discussing us, Your Grace, which is rather worse because I am the one with a shop to lose, and you are the one with a dukedom to absorb whatever scandal results. The arithmetic isn't equal, however the room wishes to pretend it is. The fiddler struck up again before he could answer, and the moment passed formally into the next set, but something in it had not passed at all, and both of them knew it. It was Nell in the end who gave them their privacy, and gave it properly. "There's a terrace just there," she murmured to Meg when the second set had ended, and Meg had pleaded warmth and needed air. "Mrs. Tovey's already on it with her sister. You'd be in full view of the windows the whole while, which is more than half the room can say for themselves at any given moment. Go on. I'll watch the door." It was, Meg understood, exactly the kind of arrangement that satisfied propriety, without abandoning her to it. Visible, accounted for, and yet, for a few minutes, blessedly out of Mrs. Findlay's immediate hearing. Julian followed her out at a careful distance, falling into step beside her once they'd reached the terrace's far end, where the light from the windows still touched them, but the worst of the room's noise did not. "You're angry," he said. "I'm not angry. I'm being sensible, which feels a great deal like anger just now." She kept her eyes on the dark garden below, though she did not descend into it. "Mrs. Findlay isn't wrong to talk, Your Grace. That's the trouble of it. She's only saying aloud what the whole room is already thinking, and what the whole room thinks tends, eventually, to become what the whole room decides. About my shop, about my custom, about whether I'm a respectable woman to buy a wedding bonnet from, or merely an amusing scandal to discuss over punch. That's unjust. It's accurate, which is worse than unjust because injustice can at least be argued with." She turned to face him properly, the terrace's modest light catching the line of his jaw, the windows full of dancers just behind them both. "You came to my shop for a ledger. I gave you the ledger and more besides, my father's whole history freely, because you needed the truth of that exchange, and I was the only one who could give it to you honestly. I did not agree to give you my reputation along with it. I have not asked for your reputation. You didn't need to ask, Your Grace. You simply had to dance with me in a room where everyone already had a theory about your Thursday mornings, and the asking became unnecessary." He was silent for a moment, and in the half-light from the windows she could see him working through something, not the practiced ease of a man accustomed to smoothing over a difficulty, but a genuine visible effort to find words equal to what he meant. "I told my sister some weeks ago," he said slowly, "that no man wants a wife with opinions, that a household runs better on agreement than argument. I believed it when I said it. I had never been disagreed with by anyone whose disagreement I respected, so the belief cost me nothing to hold. And now? Now I find myself counting the hours until Thursday for the privilege of being told I'm wrong about my own grandfather's land, and I cannot account for it by any philosophy I held a month ago." He said it plainly, without the polish of a rehearsed confession, which made it land harder than Polish would have. "I don't say this to ask anything of you tonight, Miss Hale. Only that you should know it isn't idle curiosity that brings me to your shop and hasn't been for several weeks." She should have stepped back. She intended to step back, even as she stood there in the lamplight from the windows, fully visible to anyone who cared to look, and instead she found herself looking up at him with a directness that asked, without words, the question she would not allow herself to voice. He kissed her, briefly in full view of the terrace windows. In the half-second any passing glance might have caught it, and made of it whatever it liked. It was not practiced, nor especially confident. The brief hesitation before it, the way his hand came up to her jaw, as though he expected to be stopped and was bracing for it, and it ended almost as quickly as it began, both of them drawing back half a breath at the same moment, startled by the same thing from opposite directions. Meg stepped back first. "That," she said, and her voice was not as steady as she wished it, "was a mistake. Not because anyone saw it, though someone may well have, but because I let myself want it, in a room full of people already deciding what to make of me." "Meg—" "Miss Hale." The correction came out sharper than she meant, a small instinctive retreat into formality, like pulling a door shut. "You're a duke with a boundary dispute and a sister who'll have us married by Michaelmas in her own head if she hears one word of this, and I am a woman whose entire livelihood depends on this village, deciding I'm respectable enough to trust with their daughter's wedding clothes. I cannot afford what just happened." "You can. That's the whole of the arithmetic, and it doesn't change because it was—" She stopped herself before Lovely escaped, and substituted weakly, "unexpected. I don't intend to treat you as an indiscretion to be managed. You may not intend it, but intentions aren't what Mrs. Findlay will be repeating over breakfast tomorrow." She drew a breath, steadying herself by main force. "I'll finish the ledger, Your Grace. I gave my word on the boundary matter, and I keep my word. But I think it's best we finish it without the dancing and without—" A brief gesture, encompassing the terrace, the windows, the kiss neither of them had quite recovered from, "without this. For both our sakes, but mostly for mine, since I'm the one standing to lose something real." She did not wait for his answer. She found Nell at the terrace door, asked to be taken home early, and pleaded a headache that was not, strictly speaking, a lie. Behind her, on the terrace, Julian Render stood very still for a long while, turning over a fact he had not expected to need turning over, that he had spent 3 weeks proving himself wrong about something he'd been certain of his entire life, and that the proof had arrived not as an argument he'd lost, but as something considerably more dangerous, something he very much did not want to lose. Julian did not go to Marlbury the following Thursday. He told himself it was respect for what she'd asked. Without this, she'd said, and he intended to honour it, however much the intention cost him. He spent the morning instead in his study at Wycombe Hall, the Petrie correspondence spread before him, and found he could not read 3 lines without his mind returning to a lamplit terrace, a held breath, the particular sound of her voice saying, "That was a mistake," as though she were trying to convince herself as much as him. Cordelia found him there at noon, having clearly been informed by someone that something was wrong, though he could not imagine who. "You didn't go to Marlbury. The boundary matter is nearly settled. There was no need." "There is every need, and you know it, which is precisely why you're sitting in this room pretending to read a letter you've been holding upside down for the last quarter hour." He looked down. The letter was, in fact, upside down. He set it aside without comment, which was answer enough. Cordelia sat across from him, and for once did not begin with mockery. "What happened?" "Nothing happened." "Julian, I have known you since before either of us could speak in full sentences. Something happened, and it has put you in a mood I haven't seen since Father died, which means it matters a great deal more than nothing." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to say, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted to say it to someone, and that there was no one else he trusted with it. "I kissed her," he said finally, "at the assembly on the terrace in full view of anyone who cared to look, and she told me, quite rightly, that I could afford the consequences of it, and she could not, that her whole livelihood depends on this village believing her respectable, and that a duke's attention, however sincerely meant, is far more likely to cost her that than to give her anything worth having. Cordelia's expression did not hold its usual satisfaction. "And what did you say to that?" "I said nothing adequate. I let her leave." "Did you mean it, the kiss? Not as a moment's foolishness, but as something true?" "Yes." The word came without hesitation, which told him even as he said it more than he'd allowed himself to admit aloud until now. "I have spent 3 weeks discovering that the woman I dismissed in theory before I'd even met her is the only person who has argued with me in a decade and made me grateful for it. I don't know what to call that, if not the thing you've been threatening me with since the day I said no man wants opinions in a wife." Cordelia was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, the teasing was entirely gone from her voice. "Then you have a choice in front of you, Julian, and it isn't really about the boundary papers anymore. You can decide that what you said to your sister, in a fit of irritation about Lady Frome's daughter, is a philosophy worth keeping, in which case, leave Miss Hale to her shop and her ledger and never trouble her again because anything less than that, from you, costs her something real. Or you can decide you were wrong, properly wrong, not just inconvenienced into changing your mind, and if that's the truth of it, you owe her considerably more than a kiss on a terrace and a week of silence afterward." She asked for silence. She asked for no more dancing and no more of that, in a moment when she had every reason to believe that was the safest thing she could ask for. That isn't the same as asking you never to come back and tell her the truth properly, in daylight, where it counts for something. Cordelia studied him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not amusement, but something closer to respect, cautiously extended. "You're a duke, Julian. If you mean what you say, you can offer her something more than a private apology, a settlement that protects what's hers, in fact, not merely in sentiment. If you're willing to put it in writing and mean it, that's worth a great deal more to a woman like her than pretty words in a garden. And if she refuses me regardless, then at least she refuses the truth and not a man too much a coward to offer it properly." Cordelia rose, smoothing her skirts. "For what it's worth, and I confess I did not expect to say this when I began teasing you about Lady Frome's daughter a month ago, I think you found exactly the wife you didn't know you wanted, and exactly the one you very specifically said you didn't. I should like to see you have the courage to admit it, where she can hear you." Meg, meanwhile, was discovering that pulling back was considerably easier to decide than to live with. The shop continued. The Pemberton order was finished and delivered. A new commission came in for autumn trimmings. Nell trimmed and blocked and chatted, and Meg worked beside her with the particular silence of a woman holding a great deal very carefully in place. A full week passed, then most of another, with no Thursday call and no word. Exactly as she'd asked and exactly as miserable as she had not expected it to be. "You haven't spoken his name in 4 days, Nell said on the second Tuesday after the assembly, which is, I should note, 4 more days than you've gone without mentioning him at any point since he first walked through that door." "There's nothing to mention. The boundary matter is nearly settled. He has no further reason to call, and I asked him plainly enough not to, beyond what the ledger requires." "That's not what I asked." Meg set down the ribbon she'd been measuring, with rather more precision than the task required. "What do you want me to say, Nell? That I missed the arguing? That a man I have no business wanting has made every quiet Thursday since feel like something's missing from the shop that wasn't missing before he started coming? It doesn't matter what I say. He's a duke. I'm a woman who blocks hats for a living and reads dead men's shorthand to keep food on my own table. The wanting doesn't change the arithmetic." "Doesn't it?" Nell said quietly. "You've spent 4 years telling me that the shop matters more than what anyone thinks of you for keeping it, that you'd rather answer to yourself than be comfortable answering to someone else, and I believed you, because it was true. But Meg, there's a difference between not wanting to be managed by a husband and refusing a man who's spent a month proving he has no interest in managing you at all. You're treating Julian Render like every other man who'd want you smaller. I don't think he's asked you to be smaller once." Meg did not have an answer for that, which was in itself an answer she did not much care to examine. He came on a Wednesday, which was wrong by every rule they'd established, and she knew the moment the bell rang and she saw him standing in the doorway without his hat in hand this time, but simply held loosely at his side, that this was not a visit about boundaries. "It's not Thursday," she said, because it was easier than anything else she might have said first. "No. I find I couldn't wait for Thursday to say what I came to say, and I'd rather say it badly today than perfectly a week from now, after I've had time to talk myself out of it." Nell, with admirable tact, took up a chair near the door, within call as propriety required, but with her eyes fixed determinedly on her needlework. "The boundary's settled," Meg said. "I had the final confirmation from Caro's son yesterday. Your solicitors have everything they need. There's no further reason for—" "I'm not here about the boundary." He said it plainly, the way he said most things that mattered to him. "I'm here because you told me, on that terrace, that the arithmetic wasn't equal between us, that I could afford what happened and you couldn't, and you were entirely right to say it. I've spent the days since trying to decide what a man does when he's been correctly accused of asking for something at someone else's expense and finding nothing tolerable except to undo the unfairness of it properly, where it can be seen and where it costs me something real to say." "What does that mean precisely?" "It means I'm not here to ask you to risk your reputation on the strength of a kiss on a terrace that either of us could deny tomorrow. I'm here because I told my sister a month ago that no man wants a wife with opinions, that a household runs better on agreement than on argument, that peace matters more than being disagreed with." He held her gaze, steady, unhurried, the words coming without the polish of a man performing sincerity, but with the plainness of one who had simply run out of patience for anything except the truth. "I was wrong, Meg. Not wrong in the way a man admits to be agreeable, wrong in the way that costs something to say aloud, because I built a whole philosophy on never having met a woman whose disagreement I valued more than my own comfort. And then I met you, and every certainty I held went straight out the window of your father's study within a fortnight." Meg's throat had gone tight, and she did not trust her voice yet, so she said nothing and let him continue. "I don't want a wife who agrees with me before I've finished a sentence. I want the one who tells Mr. Abel he can't tell a boundary stake from a fence post, and is right to say it. I want the one who reads her father's shorthand back to me and makes me grateful every Thursday that someone in my life still bothers to correct me. I am not offering you protection as a kindness, Meg, or a duke's charity to a milliner who's caught his attention. I'm telling you that the arithmetic you mentioned on that terrace is exactly why I should say this properly, in daylight, where Mrs. Findlay can hear every word of it if she likes, because I would rather lose every ounce of comfortable certainty I had a month ago than lose you to my own cowardice about saying so." "That's not a proposal," Meg said, finally finding her voice, though it was not entirely steady. "That's a very long way of avoiding one." Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but its near relation, recognizing exactly what she'd done by saying it. "You're right, it is." A breath. "Forgive me, I find I'm considerably less composed about this than I am about boundary disputes. I'd noticed." Margaret Hale. He said her given name properly this time, without the formality she'd insisted on at the assembly, and the sound of it in his voice did something to her composure she was not prepared to admit to. "I am not going to ask you to give up this shop, or your custom, or your father's ledgers, or any single part of the life you built, because no one else would build it for you. I'm asking whether you would consider building the next part of it beside me, as my wife, and as the woman whose opinions I have come, against every belief I held a month ago, to find I cannot do without." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had ducked under her father's doorframe with his hat in hand, and left weeks later, having read every line of a dead clerk's private alphabet of doubt, having sat through her sharpest corrections without once asking her to soften them. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "I want it understood plainly now before either of us pretends otherwise later, and I want it understood in a way that holds up to more than good intentions. I know enough law to know that a wife's property becomes her husband's the moment the ring is on her hand, unless it's settled otherwise beforehand in writing by men with the right to make it binding. So if you mean what you've said, you'll have your solicitors draw the marriage settlement so that the shop, its profits and its management are placed in trust for my sole and separate use, mine to direct, with trustees of my own choosing besides yours, so that no future quarrel, however small, can put my father's work into anyone's hands but mine. I will have a say in this marriage equal to yours, in matters large and small, and I will not be managed into silence the first time my opinion proves inconvenient at a dinner table full of your acquaintance." Julian did not hesitate. "Agreed, and I would think considerably less of myself and of you if you'd asked for anything less, or asked for it less precisely. I'll have the settlement drawn before the banns are read, and you may choose your own trustee to sit alongside mine. I'd sooner you doubted my affection than my arithmetic." "Then yes," Meg said, and felt something in her chest unknot that had been wound tight since the terrace. Properly in daylight and properly in writing. Yes. Nell, watching Meg dress that morning in the back room of the shop, The same room, the same scarred desk, now cleared of ledgers for the day, found herself unexpectedly tearful over a length of ribbon. "You're not to cry," Meg told her. "You'll ruin the trimming." "I'm not crying over the trimming." Nell wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist regardless. "I'm crying because 4 years ago you told me you'd rather run this shop alone into the ground than let any man tell you what to do with it. And now look at you, marrying a duke with a trust deed to your own name besides, and somehow it's not even a contradiction." "It isn't," Meg said, considering it. "That's rather the point. I didn't change what I wanted. I simply found someone willing to put it in writing." The wedding took place at Marlbury's own small church, not Wycombe Hall's private chapel, which Julian had offered and Meg had declined, on the grounds that a village that had watched her build a shop from nothing deserved to watch her marry from the same ground. The marriage settlement had been drawn precisely as promised. The shop and its profits held in trust for Meg's sole and separate use, 2 trustees appointed, one of her choosing, a solicitor in the nearby market town who had known her father, and one of Julian's, with terms that gave her sole direction over its management regardless of what passed or did not pass between husband and wife in any other matter. Julian had read the document twice before signing it, and had said, handing back the pen, that he hoped it would prove the least necessary precaution he ever took on her behalf, precisely because he intended to make it unnecessary through conduct rather than law. Cordelia stood beside Julian as he waited, and leaned in only once just before the ceremony began. "No man wants a wife with opinions," she murmured. "I believe I asked you to write that down. I believe I've spent the last 2 months unwriting it as thoroughly as I can manage. See that you keep unwriting it. I intend to remind you of it at every anniversary for the rest of your life." I would expect nothing less. Mrs. Findlay, to no one's great surprise, secured a position near the front, and discussed the match with anyone who would listen, though the substance of her commentary had shifted considerably from scandal to something closer to proprietary pride, as though she had personally arranged the whole affair through sheer force of gossip. "I always said there was something in those Thursday mornings," she told the baker's wife, with the confidence of a woman who had, in fact, said something considerably less generous at the time. The marriage settled, as marriages do, into the particular rhythm of 2 people learning the shape of a shared life. The shop remained. Hales, the sign still said, exactly as her father had left it, run entirely under Meg's own direction as the settlement provided, with a forewoman engaged within the year to manage the counter on the mornings the Duchess's other obligations required her at the hall. Julian, for his part, discovered that a household run on argument rather than agreement was not in fact the exhausting prospect he had once assumed. He discovered it most clearly in the particular pleasure of being told, across the breakfast table, that he had misjudged a tenant's request, or underestimated a steward's competence, or, once, memorably, that his understanding of his own grandfather's character had been considerably too generous, all delivered with the same brisk certainty she'd once used to refuse him her father's ledger, and all, in nearly every case, correct. 7 years on, Wycombe Hall had acquired a sound it had not possessed in Julian's memory of his own childhood: noise. Specifically, the noise of 2 children who had inherited, in roughly equal measure, their father's height and their mother's complete inability to be told what to think. "Mama says I may have an opinion about it," announced Eleanor Render, aged 5, to her father, regarding the entirely separate matter of whether she ought to wear the blue ribbon or the green to the village fete. "She says a person is allowed to have opinions about her own ribbons." "Your mamma," Julian said gravely, "is very rarely wrong about anything, and I would not advise arguing the point." "Papa says that," Eleanor informed her younger brother Thomas, not yet 3 and chiefly occupied with attempting to eat a button, "because Mama once told him no man wants a wife with opinions, and Papa believed her, and then he changed his mind. Aunt Cordelia told me. She tells me a great deal." "Your Aunt Cordelia," Julian said with the particular long-suffering affection of a man who had given up expecting his sister to keep any story to herself, "tells everyone a great deal, and has been telling that particular story for 7 years with considerable relish." Meg appeared in the doorway then, dressed for the fete, a length of green ribbon already triumphant in her daughter's hair, a small decisive correction made without breaking stride, the same brisk certainty Julian had first encountered across a hat block in a shop that still bore her father's name. The shop itself had prospered in the years since, though not by any means Meg had been ashamed to claim. Her forewoman, Susan, managed the counter and the daily custom with a steady hand. Meg herself still came down from the hall twice a week to oversee the ledgers and choose the season's trimmings. Precisely as the settlement allowed, and no one in the county thought any longer to remark upon, the arrangement having become, through 5 years of quiet consistency, simply a known and respected fact of the district, rather than a scandal anyone troubled to revive. The neighbouring estates sent their custom there still, not because a duchess stood behind the counter, she did not and had never pretended to, but because the milliner who did stand there had been trained in the same careful, exacting standard Meg had learned from her father, and because everyone in 3 counties understood precisely whose name still stood, unaltered, above the door. "Is he telling them the story again?" Meg asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. "Aunt Cordelia is telling them the story again," Julian said. "I am merely confirming the facts as recorded, since I understand a careful man writes down what he believes, and then writes down whether he still believes it." It was, Meg thought, watching him gather Thomas up against one shoulder, with the easy competence of long practice, an extraordinarily specific thing to say, and an extraordinarily exact echo of her father's old habit, the little flag above an entry that meant witnessed, terms confirmed by both parties. She had not expected all those years ago that the Duke who'd ducked beneath her father's doorframe would come eventually to speak in her father's own private alphabet of doubt and correction. She found she did not mind it in the least. "And what does the record show, Your Grace?" she asked, "regarding your original opinion on wives with opinions?" "The record shows," Julian said, taking her hand as they walked out toward the waiting carriage, Eleanor already several steps ahead and arguing with no one in particular about the merits of green over blue, that the original entry was struck through some years ago and the correction stands confirmed by witness, repeatedly, and with no further claim to be raised by either house. "That," Meg said, "is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, and it is, I note, phrased exactly like a boundary settlement." "I learned my letters from a very good clerk's daughter," Julian said. "I thought it only fitting." They walked on together toward the fete, the children ahead of them arguing happily about ribbons, the long-stopped church clock in the village behind them still fixed at 2:15, Marlbury keeping its own time, as it always had, careless of the world rushing past, while the people who lived inside it went on undisturbed, exactly as they meant to.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.